Hey everyone, Grandpa here. Tonight, I'm sharing a magical tale that will take you on a journey filled with wonder and mystery. So, grab a blanket, get cozy, and let's dive into the story together. The city of Arindale bustled with life, its cobblestone streets filled with the chatter of merchants, the clang of horse hooves, and the hum of distant factories. Yet, towering above the modern chaos was an ancient relic, the old Clocktower. Once the pride of Arindale, the Clocktower now stood as a hollow shell of its former glory. Its massive hands were frozen at 1201, rusted and lifeless. The tower was shrouded in mystery, a place where time seemed to stand still. For decades, it was said that the clock had stopped on the day its last keeper vanished, leaving behind whispers of curses and forbidden knowledge. For Simon Gray, the clock tower wasn't just a monument of intrigue. It was a symbol of purpose. As a watchmaker who had spent years mending the clocks of Arindale, Simon had always been drawn to its silent power. His small workshop sat in its shadow, his window offering a daily view of the frozen face. One stormy evening, Simon closed up his shop, his hands still smelling of oil and brass. The rain pelted against the windows as he reached for his worn leather coat. Just as he was about to head home, a strange thought struck him. The clock tower. Simon often passed the tower on his way home. But tonight, something felt different. The air carried a charge, an almost magnetic pull urging him closer. They hesitated for a moment before giving in to the strange compulsion. The iron gate at the tower's base creaked loudly as he pushed it open. Dust swirled in the damp air as Simon stepped into the abandoned structure. Cobwebs clung to the rafters, and the faint smell of mildew lingered. As he inspected the room, his foot caught on a loose floorboard. He crouched down, his heart racing as he pried the board loose. Beneath it was a hidden compartment, and inside was a leather-bound journal. The journal's pages were brittle, filled with intricate diagrams of clockwork mechanisms and cryptic notes written in a shaky hand. One phrase repeated throughout the entries: "The core must remain dormant." Simon's pulse quickened. The notes spoke of a device hidden within the tower, a timekeeper's core, capable of manipulating time itself. The journal's final warning sent a chill down his spine. To awaken the core is to tempt the collapse of all time. Its power is not meant for mortal hands. Despite the warnings, Simon couldn't resist the pull of curiosity. He climbed the spiral staircase leading to the tower's upper chambers. Each step creaked under his weight, and the wind howled through broken windows, making the entire structure groan. At the top, Simon found the heart of the clock tower. Gears as large as carriage wheels loomed in the dim light, their intricate teeth frozen mid-motion. The mechanism was a marvel, far beyond the craftsmanship of any modern clock. As Simon examined the gears, he noticed something odd, a faint glow emanating from behind the central panel. He reached down, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. A hidden latch clicked, and the panel swung open, revealing a keyhole shaped like a sunburst. Simon's breath caught. The journal had mentioned this, a lock designed to guard the core. But where was the key? Before Simon could think further, the sound of footsteps echoed below. He froze, the hair on his neck standing on end. Who would be in the tower at this hour? "Simon Gray!" a voice called, sharp and commanding. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman in a dark cloak, her green eyes glinting like polished emeralds. "Who are you?" Simon demanded, his voice trembling slightly. The woman smirked. "I could ask you the same. You've been meddling in things far beyond your understanding." Simon frowned, his hand instinctively moving toward the journal in his pocket. "How do you know my name?" The woman stepped closer, her boots clicking on the stone floor. "Because you're the reason I'm here. My name is Eleanor Vale, and if you value your life, you'll stop whatever it is you're doing." Simon's curiosity burned brighter than his fear. What is this core? Why is it hidden here? Eleanor's expression darkened. The core is not a machine, it's a force, alive in ways you can't comprehend. My family has guarded its secret for generations, keeping it out of the hands of people like you. Her words stung, but Simon's intrigue outweighed his caution. If it's so dangerous, why not destroy it? Eleanor's gaze shifted, her voice lowering. Because the core remembers. Destroying it doesn't erase its power, it releases it with catastrophic consequences. The last time someone tried, time itself fractured. Simon stepped back, his mind racing. He could see the truth in her eyes, but something didn't add up. If it's so dangerous, why leave it here? Why let anyone near it? Eleanor hesitated, her lips tightening. Because the core, it binds itself to those who seek it, and now it's bound to you. Eleanor reached into her cloak, pulling out a small dagger engraved with intricate runes. "Take this," she said, her voice urgent. "If you're foolish enough to keep going, you'll need it. But I warn you, there's no turning back once the core awakens." Simon stared at the dagger, his thoughts swirling. He didn't trust Eleanor, but her words only fueled his desire to uncover the truth. As she disappeared into the shadows, Simon turned back to the glowing keyhole. The gears of the Clocktower seemed to groan in anticipation, as if the ancient structure was waiting for him to make his choice. And Simon, driven by equal parts curiosity and defiance, decided to continue. The gears groaned louder as Simon stared at the glowing keyhole, the faint light casting eerie shadows across the Clocktower's inner chamber. His hands trembled as he pulled the dagger Eleanor had given him from his coat pocket, its blade glinting in the dim light. He didn't trust her, but her words lingered in his mind. Once the core awakens, there's no turning back. Despite the warnings, Simon's curiosity burned brighter than his fear. He slid the dagger into the keyhole, feeling a strange resistance as if the tower itself resisted his intrusion. With a sharp click, the gears shuddered, and a deep hum resonated through the walls. Suddenly, the entire room came alive. The gears turned for the first time in a century, the vibrations shaking dust from the rafters. A hidden panel slid open, revealing the core, a pulsating sphere of golden light, its surface swirling like molten metal. Simon stepped closer, the hum growing louder with each step. The core seemed alive, its energy pulling at him like a magnet. He reached out, his fingers inches from its surface, when the room erupted with light. Simon's vision blurred, the world around him dissolving into a kaleidoscope of colors. When the light faded, he found himself standing in a bustling marketplace, surrounded by people in Victorian-era clothing. What is this?" Simon muttered, his heart pounding. A street vendor called out, hawking apples for a single penny. Horse-drawn carriages rattled over cobblestones, and children played with wooden hoops. Simon realized He wasn't just seeing the past, he was in the past. But something was wrong. The colors around him flickered, the people's faces twisting into grotesque shapes before snapping back to normal. The air felt heavy, charged with energy, as if reality itself was straining under the weight of his presence. Suddenly, the scene shifted. Simon was back in the Clocktower, but he wasn't alone. Standing before him were three strangers, their expressions as confused and alarmed as his own. The first was a tall man with a strong jaw and sharp eyes, dressed in a tattered military uniform. He held a rifle at his side, though it looked as though it hadn't been fired in years. "Where am I?" he barked, his voice deep and commanding. "Who are you?" The second was a young woman with wild curls and quick darting eyes. Her clothes were patched and mismatched, a pouch of stolen trinkets slung over her shoulder. She glanced around nervously, her hand resting on a knife tucked into her belt. "Is this some kind of trick?" she demanded, her voice sharp with suspicion. The third was a bespectacled man with a calm demeanor, his suit crisp and futuristic. He carried a sleek device that hummed faintly, scanning the room as he muttered calculations under his breath. Simon's voice trembled as he spoke. "I don't know what's happening. I think the Corps brought us together." "The Corps?" the military man snapped. "What in blazes is that?" Simon hesitated before explaining. "It's a device, something that manipulates time. I don't understand it fully, but it's powerful." The man scowled. "I'm Captain Elias Thorne, formerly of Her Majesty's Army. Wherever this place is, I want out." The woman crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Name's Amara. And if this is your fault, Clockmaker, you'd better fix it." The scientist adjusted his glasses, his voice calm and precise. "Professor Cedric Hargrove, temporal physicist. I've been researching anomalies like this for years, but I've never seen anything like this core." Before Simon could respond, footsteps echoed through the chamber. Eleanor emerged from the shadows, her expression a mixture of anger and resignation. "You've done it now," she said, her voice low and tense. "The Corps' energy is pulling fragments of time together. These people were plucked from their timelines because of you." Simon's chest tightened. "I didn't mean to." "It doesn't matter what you meant," Eleanor snapped. "If we don't stabilize the Corps, the fractures will worsen. Time itself will unravel." Amara raised an eyebrow. "And why should we believe you exactly?" Eleanor ignored her, addressing the group. "We need to work together. The Corps is dangerous, but it can be contained. The Clocktower was built to anchor it, but now that it's active, it's destabilizing everything." Cedric nodded thoughtfully. "She's right. I've seen similar effects in my research. Temporal fractures can cascade rapidly if not addressed." Elias frowned, gripping his rifle tighter. "And what happens to us? Do we just disappear?" Eleanor hesitated. "If the fractures stabilize, you'll return to your proper timelines. But if they don't—" She trailed off, her silence more ominous than any words. The air suddenly grew cold, and the ground beneath them trembled. A low hum filled the chamber, growing louder by the second. "What's happening?" Simon shouted. Eleanor's eyes widened. "A fracture! Hold on to something!" The room blurred, the walls dissolving into a swirling vortex of light and shadow. When the world solidified again, they were no longer in the Clocktower. They stood in a dense jungle, the air thick with humidity and the sound of distant drums echoing through the trees. vines wrapped around ancient ruins, their carvings glowing faintly in the dim light. "This isn't right," Cedric said, scanning the surroundings with his device. "This timeline shouldn't intersect with ours." Elias raised his rifle, his eyes scanning the trees. "Stay alert. We're not alone." As if on cue, a shadow moved in the underbrush. A figure emerged, a man clad in ceremonial armor, his face obscured by a mask. He raised a spear, his movement swift and precise. Amara drew her knife, stepping into a defensive stance. Great. Time travel and murderous locals. This just gets better and better. Before the man could attack, the ground shook violently. The ruins began to collapse, the carvings glowing brighter as the fracture destabilized further. "Run!" Eleanor shouted, grabbing Simon's arm. The group sprinted through the jungle, the sounds of cracking stone and falling debris echoing behind them. As they reached a clearing, a blinding light enveloped them, pulling them back into the vortex. They landed back in the Clocktower, gasping for breath. The core's hum was louder than ever, its light pulsing erratically. Eleanor turned to Simon, her face pale. "That was just the beginning. If we don't fix this, the fractures will destroy everything." The core's golden light pulsated violently, casting long, flickering shadows across the chamber. The air felt heavier, thick with tension, as if the tower itself strained against the energy it contained. Simon, Eleanor, Elias, Amara, and Cedric stood in silence, each grappling with the weight of their situation. Simon turned to Eleanor, his voice shaky. "The fractures, they're getting worse. What do we do?" Eleanor, her gaze fixed on the core, didn't answer immediately. "The core is feeding on its own energy, pulling fragments of time into this place. If we don't act soon, the fractures will expand beyond the tower. They'll spread across Arindale and then the world." Cedric adjusted his device, its screen flickering with incomprehensible data. "We're not just dealing with one timeline here. The core is collapsing parallel realities into one. If this continues, it won't just be our worlds that are destroyed, it'll be time itself." Elias tightened his grip on his rifle. "Then let's destroy the damn thing." "No!" Eleanor snapped, her voice sharp. "Destroying the core without containing its energy will only make things worse. We have to stabilize it." Before they could form a plan, the room shuddered violently. A deafening crack echoed through the chamber as a fracture tore through the floor, sending jagged lines of golden light spidering outward. The group stumbled, narrowly avoiding the collapsing stone. Eleanor cursed under her breath. "The core is destabilizing faster than I thought." The fracture expanded, enveloping the group in a blinding light. When the light faded, they found themselves standing in the middle of Arindale, but it wasn't the city, Simon knew. The cobblestone streets were deserted, the buildings crumbling and overgrown with vines. The sky was a swirling canvas of stormy grays and electric gold, with fragments of other timelines flickering in and out of existence. A medieval castle loomed where the city's library should have been, while futuristic monorails hung suspended mid-collapse. "What is this place?" Amara whispered, her voice tinged with awe and fear. Simon scanned the distorted landscape, his stomach churning. It's Arindale, but it's broken." Cedric's device beeped frantically. "These aren't just fractures. The core is merging timelines. This isn't one Arindale, it's all of them." A distant rumble drew their attention. A group of shadowy figures emerged from the ruins, their forms flickering like static. As they came closer, Their features became clearer, faces twisted with anger, their bodies wrapped in tattered uniforms from different eras. Elias raised his rifle, his expression grim. They're soldiers from my time. The shadows moved with unnatural speed, their weapons raised. Before anyone could react, they charged. Elias fired a warning shot into the air, but the figures didn't flinch. "Run!" Eleanor shouted, grabbing Simon's arm and pulling him down a side street. The group scattered, dodging through the labyrinthine streets of the fractured city. The shadowy soldiers pursued them relentlessly, their movements erratic and jerky, as if they were puppets on invisible strings. Amara ducked into an alley, her knife glinting in the dim light. She waited until one of the shadows passed before lunging forward, slashing at its midsection. Her blade passed through it harmlessly, and the shadow turned, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. "Bad idea," she muttered, turning and sprinting after the others. After what felt like an eternity of running, the group stumbled into an abandoned building, slamming the door shut behind them. Cedric activated a small device, creating a faint blue barrier that crackled around the entrance. "That should hold them off," he said, panting. Simon leaned against the wall, his chest heaving. "What were those things?" Eleanor's expression was grim. "Echoes. They're fragments of people who've been pulled into the fractures. They're not alive anymore, but they're not gone either. They're trapped." Elias paced the room, his fists clenched. "We can't keep running. We need a plan." Cedric nodded. "We need to find the anchor point, the place where the core's energy is strongest. If we can reach it, we might be able to stabilize the fractures." Simon pulled the journal from his pocket, flipping through its pages. "The Clocktower. It's the center of everything. If we can get back there—" A sudden crash interrupted him. The shadows were hammering against the barrier, their distorted faces pressed against the flickering blue light. "We don't have much time," Eleanor said, drawing her dagger. "Let's move." The group made their way through the distorted city, sticking to the shadows to avoid the roaming echoes. The streets were a surreal mix of eras, horses pulling futuristic carriages, medieval archways standing beside neon-lit skyscrapers. The fractures grew worse with every step, the air rippling like heat waves. Their path led them to an old stone bridge that spanned a chasm of swirling light. The bridge was cracked and crumbling, its edges flickering as if it might vanish at any moment. "We have to cross," Simon said, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his chest. Elias went first, his rifle slung over his shoulder as he tested each step. The others followed, their breaths held as the bridge groaned under their weight. Halfway across, a deafening roar echoed through the chasm. A massive shadow emerged from the swirling light, a creature with wings of smoke and eyes like burning coals. It let out a bone-rattling screech, its form flickering as it lunged toward the group. "Run!" Eleanor shouted, drawing her dagger. The bridge shook violently as the creature attacked, its claws tearing through the stone. Amara stumbled, grabbing onto Cedric's arm as the edge of the bridge crumbled beneath her. "Hold on!" Cedric shouted, pulling her back just as the creature dove toward them. Elias turned, raising his rifle. "Get across! I'll hold it off!" Simon hesitated, but Eleanor grabbed his arm, dragging him toward the other side. "We can't stop now!" Elias fired a shot, the bullet hitting the creature's wing. It screeched in pain, its form flickering as if it might dissolve, but it didn't stop. With one final desperate push, The group made it to the other side as the bridge collapsed behind them, taking the creature with it. As they approached the clock tower, the fractures grew more intense. The streets flickered between eras, each shift accompanied by a deafening hum. The tower loomed ahead, its gears turning erratically as golden light spilled from its broken face. Simon felt a strange pull in his chest, the core's energy calling to him. He stopped, his eyes unfocused, as a vision overtook him. He saw himself as a child, standing at the base of the clock tower. His parents were there, their faces filled with sorrow as they handed him a small glowing object, a piece of the core. "It's the only way," his father said, his voice heavy with regret. The vision faded, and Simon staggered, Eleanor catching his arm. "What did you see?" she asked, her voice urgent. Simon's eyes met hers, a mix of fear and determination in his gaze. "The core. It's been a part of me all along." The group reached the base of the clock tower, its once grand facade now fractured and glowing with an eerie golden light. The air around it hummed, thick with the core's energy. Each step closer made the world ripple, fragments of timelines colliding and breaking apart. Simon stood at the edge of the crumbling courtyard, his eyes fixed on the tower. The vision of his parents still lingered in his mind, the glowing fragment they had entrusted to him, the sorrow etched into their faces. His chest tightened as the realization set in. The core wasn't just connected to him, it had always been a part of his story. "Simon," Eleanor said, her voice pulling him back to the present, "if we're going to stabilize the core, we need to move now. The fractures are spreading faster than I anticipated." Simon nodded, though his mind raced with questions. What had his parents done? What was his role in all of this? Inside the tower, the air was suffocatingly thick with tension. The gears groaned and creaked, their movement erratic and unnatural. Golden light poured from cracks in the walls, illuminating the chamber in an otherworldly glow. Cedric adjusted his device, his brow furrowed. "The core's energy is peaking. If we don't act soon, it'll collapse completely and take all of us with it." Elias paced the room, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "Then why are we wasting time talking? Let's destroy the damn thing." "We've been over this," Eleanor snapped, stepping in front of him. "Destroying the core will only make things worse. We have to stabilize it." "And what if that doesn't work?" Elias retorted, his voice rising. "What if this is all just some fool's errand?" The tension between them was palpable, the air crackling with unspoken fears. Amara, leaning against a crumbling pillar, smirked. "So, what's the plan then? Argue until the world ends?" Simon finally spoke, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "We need to understand what we're dealing with first. There's something about the core, something it's trying to show me." As Simon approached the glowing sphere in the center of the room, a wave of energy radiated outward, sending a chill down everyone's spines. The core pulsed like a heartbeat, its light shifting and swirling with an almost hypnotic rhythm. Simon reached out, his fingers brushing against its surface. Instantly, his vision blurred, and the world dissolved around him. Simon stood in a familiar room, his childhood home. The clock on the mantel ticked softly, and the smell of lavender filled the air. He saw his parents, their faces younger, but weighed with worry. They stood over a table, whispering urgently as they examined a glowing fragment of the core. Are you sure about this? His mother asked, her voice trembling. If we give it to him, it'll bind to him forever. His father nodded, though his expression was grim. It's the only way to keep it safe. If the wrong people find it. His voice trailed off as he glanced at the door as if sensing someone was watching. Simon's younger self entered the room, his small hands reaching for the glowing fragment. His parents knelt beside him, their faces filled with love and regret. You'll understand someday, his father said softly. You'll know what to do when the time comes. The vision faded, and Simon stumbled back, gasping for breath. The others rushed to his side, their faces etched with concern. What did you see? Eleanor asked, her voice urgent. Simon's hands trembled as he spoke. The core. My parents gave me a piece of it when I was a child. They said it was the only way to keep it safe. Elias frowned, his grip tightening on his rifle. So, you've been connected to this thing all along? And you're just telling us now? I didn't know, Simon shot back, his voice rising. I didn't even remember until now. Eleanor's gaze softened. The core chooses who it binds to. Your connection to it might be the only thing keeping it from tearing itself apart. As the group debated their next move, Amara slipped away, her footsteps silent as she moved toward the core. Her eyes gleamed with determination as she pulled a small satchel from her pouch. Elias noticed her movement and stepped forward. What do you think you're doing? Amara turned, her expression defiant. I'm doing what none of you have the guts to do. This core is powerful, more powerful than anything in our worlds. I'm not letting it go to waste. Stop! Eleanor warned, stepping toward her. You don't understand what you're dealing with. I understand enough, Amara snapped. This thing can change everything, wealth, power, time itself, and you want to lock it away? Before anyone could stop her, Amara opened the satchel, revealing a device she had stolen from Cedric. She placed it against the core, and the room exploded with light. The core's energy surged, the golden light turning blindingly bright. The chamber shook violently, chunks of stone falling from the ceiling. The group was thrown to the ground as fractures tore through the walls, each one glowing with molten intensity. What have you done? Eleanor shouted, scrambling to her feet. Amara staggered back, her face pale as she realized the magnitude of her actions. I didn't mean for this to happen. Cedric's device beeped frantically, its screen flashing red. The core's energy is spiraling out of control. If we don't stop it now, the fractures will consume everything. Simon stood, his jaw clenched. We have to go back to the heart of the tower. If I'm connected to the core, maybe I can stabilize it. Elias nodded grimly. Then let's move, before it's too late. As the group made their way deeper into the tower, Simon felt the pull of the core growing stronger. The fractures around them widened, revealing glimpses of other timelines, a medieval battlefield, a futuristic cityscape, a quiet village lost to history. At the heart of the tower, the core pulsed wildly, its light cracking and distorting the air around it. Simon stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached for the glowing sphere. The core's voice echoed in his mind, a chorus of whispers that spoke in unison. You are the keeper. You are the key. Simon closed his eyes, the weight of his connection to the core settling over him. He turned to the others, his voice steady. This is my burden. It always has been. The Clocktower's core chamber was unrecognizable. The once rusted gears and cracked walls now pulsed with golden light, fractured by swirling energy that radiated from the core. The air was thick with tension, every breath heavy with the weight of unraveling time. The group stood at the edge of the chaos, their faces lit by the core's erratic glow. Simon stepped forward, the core's pull almost irresistible. "It's reaching its breaking point," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "If we don't stop it now, there won't be anything left." Eleanor moved beside him, gripping the dagger tightly. "You're the only one it listens to. The core chose you for a reason." "But why?" Simon asked, turning to face her. "Why me? Why my family?" Eleanor hesitated, her gaze flickering to the core. "The core binds itself to those who can protect it. Your parents must have known the truth. They gave you a piece of it to keep it safe." Simon clenched his fists, frustration boiling over. "They didn't just keep it safe. They burdened me with something I didn't ask for." Before Eleanor could respond, the chamber shuddered violently. The core's light flared, and shadowy figures emerged from the fractures, their forms flickering like static. These weren't the echoes they had encountered before. These were larger, more menacing, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of rage. "They're protecting the core!" Cedric shouted, his device beeping wildly. "It's using them as a defense mechanism." Elias raised his rifle, firing a warning shot. The shadows didn't flinch. Instead, they surged forward, their distorted limbs reaching for the group. "Hold them off!" Eleanor yelled, stepping in front of Simon. "You need to focus on the core." Simon hesitated, his eyes darting between the advancing shadows and the pulsing sphere. Eleanor grabbed his shoulder, her voice firm. "You're the only one who can do this. Trust yourself." Elias fired another shot, hitting one of the shadows square in the chest. The figure dissolved into mist, but two more took its place. Amara darted forward, her knife flashing as she slashed at the shadows, though her strikes barely slowed them down. "Keep moving!" she shouted, dodging a swipe from one of the creatures. "These things don't go down easy." Cedric adjusted his device, activating a beam of blue light that disoriented the shadows momentarily. "This will buy us a few seconds, but it won't last long." Eleanor and Elias worked together to push the creatures back, but the shadows seemed endless. Every time one dissolved, another stepped through the fractures, their numbers multiplying with each surge of the core's energy. Amid the chaos, Simon approached the core. Its light burned brighter the closer he got, the hum growing deafening. The visions returned. His parents, the fragment of the core they had entrusted to him, and their tearful goodbye. The core's voice echoed in his mind, a cacophony of whispers. "You are the keeper. You are the key. You must choose." Simon fell to his knees, clutching his head. "What do you want from me?" he shouted. The core's whispers shifted, becoming clearer. "Restore balance. The cost is great, but the choice is yours." Simon closed his eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could feel the core's energy coursing through him, binding him to its will. He opened his eyes and turned to Eleanor. "There's no stabilizing this thing," he said, his voice breaking. "It's too far gone. The only way to stop it is to destroy it." Eleanor's face fell. "Destroying it will release its energy into you. You won't survive." Simon nodded, the fear in his eyes giving way to quiet resolve. "I know." As Simon stepped closer to the core, Elias's voice rang out. "Wait!" Simon turned to see Elias pointing his rifle at him, his face twisted with desperation. There has to be another way. We can use the core to fix everything, to rewrite the past. You can't control it, Eleanor said, stepping between them. No one can. Elias's grip tightened on his rifle. I'm not going back to a timeline where I'm a failure. I abandoned my men, my family. This is my chance to make it right. Simon shook his head. You'll only make it worse. The core doesn't give second chances. It destroys everything it touches. Before Elias could respond, Amara lunged at him, knocking the rifle from his hands. The two of them struggled briefly before Cedric stepped in, separating them. We don't have time for this, Cedric shouted. If we don't act now, none of us are going back to anything. Simon turned back to the core, his heart pounding as he reached for its surface. The energy surged, wrapping around him like molten chains. He gasped as the core's light enveloped him, its whispers growing louder. The fractures in the room began to heal, the golden cracks sealing themselves as the core's energy was drawn inward. The shadows dissolved, their forms flickering into nothingness. The gears of the clock tower groaned as they slowed, the chamber falling into an eerie silence. Simon fell to his knees, the core's light fading as its energy flowed into him. He looked up at the group, his face pale but peaceful. It's done, he whispered. The fractures are closing. Eleanor rushed to his side, her hands shaking as she knelt beside him. Simon, you can't hold this. You have to let go. Simon smiled faintly. It's okay. This was always my burden to bear. The core pulsed one final time before dissolving into light, leaving only a faint shimmer in the air. Simon collapsed, his body still as the chamber grew silent. The clock tower began to shake, its walls cracking as the energy that had sustained it for centuries dissipated. Eleanor and the others scrambled to their feet, dragging Simon's lifeless body as the tower crumbled around them. They barely made it outside before the tower collapsed in on itself, the once proud structure reduced to rubble. The golden light faded from the sky, and the fractures in the city healed, the timelines returning to their rightful places. The group stood in silence, staring at the pile of rubble where the clock tower had stood. The air was still, the chaos of the fractures replaced by an eerie calm. Eleanor knelt beside Simon's body, her eyes brimming with tears. He saved us, she said softly. He saved everything. Cedric adjusted his glasses, his voice quiet. The core's energy is gone. Time is stable again. Elias looked down at Simon, his expression heavy with guilt. He didn't deserve this. Amara, for once, said nothing. She simply placed a hand on Simon's shoulder, her face unreadable. As the group prepared to leave, a faint glow caught Eleanor's eye. She turned to see a small shard of the core, pulsing softly in the rubble. She picked it up, its warmth familiar and comforting. Maybe this is a new beginning, she said, tucking the shard into her pocket. The group walked away from the ruins of the clock tower, each of them changed by the journey they had taken. The city of Arindale slowly returned to normal, its people unaware of how close they had come to the end of everything. And somewhere, in the quiet stillness of time, Simon's sacrifice was remembered, not as a burden, but as a gift. Arindale awoke to a morning of quiet renewal. The fractured skies, once streaked with golden cracks and flickering timelines, now stretched clear and blue. The city seemed unaware of the chaos it had narrowly avoided. its people carrying on as if nothing had happened. But for those who had faced the core's power, life would never be the same. Eleanor, Cedric, Elias, and Amara stood on the edge of the ruins, staring at the pile of rubble that had once been the old Clocktower. "It's strange," Cedric said, adjusting his glasses. "For a structure so important, no one seems to remember it existed." Eleanor nodded, her hand brushing against the faintly glowing shard of the core hidden in her pocket. "That's the way it was designed. The Clocktower was never meant to be remembered. It was meant to protect time, quietly and unseen." Amara snorted, her tone lighter but tinged with sadness. "Well, it didn't do a very good job of that, did it?" "No," Eleanor replied, her voice soft. "But Simon did." The group lingered in silence, each lost in their thoughts. Elias, ever the soldier, broke the stillness. "What happens now?" Eleanor looked to Cedric, who had been scanning the area with his device. "The timelines are stabilizing," he said. "Whatever energy the core released when Simon absorbed it is sealing the fractures. Time is returning to normal, mostly." "Mostly?" Elias raised an eyebrow. Cedric hesitated. "There will always be echoes, fragments of what happened. People might feel déjà vu or notice small inconsistencies, but the core's influence is gone." "And us?" Amara asked, her arms crossed. "Do we just go back to where we came from?" Eleanor nodded. "The core's final act was to return us to our proper timelines. Once we leave this place, the fractures will close completely and we'll forget this ever happened." Amara frowned, her usual bravado dimmed. "Forget everything?" Eleanor's expression softened. "It's better that way. Simon's sacrifice wasn't just to save time. It was to give us the chance to move on." As the group prepared to part ways, Eleanor stepped forward, pulling the shard of the core from her pocket. It pulsed faintly in her hand, its golden light soft and steady. "This is all that's left," she said, her voice heavy with meaning. "A fragment of the core's energy. It's harmless now, but it's still connected to what Simon did." Cedric eyed the shard with fascination, but he didn't reach for it. "It should stay with you," he said. "You're the last of the guardians, after all." Eleanor looked at the shard, her heart aching. "Maybe, but this doesn't belong to me. It belongs to Simon." With that, she knelt beside the rubble, placing the shard among the stones. Its light dimmed, then disappeared, as if it had become one with the ruins. As the shard faded, a warm breeze swept through the ruins, carrying with it a faint, familiar hum. For a brief moment, the group saw Simon's figure standing atop the rubble, his face calm and content. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "Simon!" The figure smiled, then dissolved into golden light, scattering like fireflies in the wind. "Do you think he's at peace?" Amara asked, her voice uncharacteristically soft. Eleanor smiled faintly. "I know he is." One by one, the group began to fade, their timelines calling them home. Elias stood tall, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He turned to Eleanor and gave a sharp nod. "You're a good leader. Simon was lucky to have you." "Take care of yourself, Captain," Eleanor replied. Amara rolled her eyes, but gave Eleanor a sly grin. "You're not so bad for a guardian. Try not to mess things up too much." Cedric adjusted his glasses, his expression thoughtful. "This has been enlightening. If I ever remember any of this, I'll make sure Simon's story isn't forgotten." Eleanor watched as they each disappeared, their forms flickering like fading stars. When the last of them was gone, she stood alone in the rubble, her heart heavy, but filled with a quiet resolve. Months passed, and the city of Arindale continued to rebuild. Where the Clocktower had once stood, a small park was erected, its centerpiece a modest stone monument engraved with a single phrase: "Time doesn't just heal, it remembers." Eleanor visited the park often, sitting beneath the shade of a newly planted oak tree. She carried no shard, no relic of the core, only the memories of what had been. And though the world moved on, she held on to the hope that Simon's sacrifice had not only saved time, but also taught them something valuable, that every moment, no matter how fleeting, is a gift worth cherishing. Far beyond the realm of mortal understanding, Simon's essence lingered in the quiet stillness of time. He was neither bound by it nor consumed by it. Instead, he watched over it, a silent guardian ensuring that the past, present, and future flowed as they should. And though he was no longer part of the world he had saved, Simon knew that his sacrifice had not been in vain. Time moved forward, as it always had, carrying with it the echoes of those who had fought to protect it. Thank you for joining me tonight for this magical tale. Which part of the story captured your imagination the most? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more cozy bedtime stories, and share it with someone who could use a little relaxation tonight. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you again soon for another enchanting adventure.